Hello everybody and welcome back to Theology, where we drink tea and talk theology. It's nearly Christmas and I hope everyone is taking the time to enjoy this time of year and be thankful for what we do have. Today we are drinking the Christmas breakfast tea again, as that's been our Christmas tea, and it's still technically Advent. However, we aren't talking about the Advent themes today. We are talking about a time period shortly after Christmas. But we are talking about Jesus' childhood. We don't have lots of information regarding his early years, and there are so many questions that we could have, and many of which, for me personally at least, are between the tension of Jesus as God and Jesus as human, the tension between the divine and humane, and how being a human child specifically worked in that space. But all of those questions are questions that I really have about Jesus as a whole that are like beyond the level of what human understanding can really do, and it's just applied to this specific context, like about God's omnipresence and omnipotence and how that worked in a human and how some other attributes might have worked. But today I'll be focusing on what we do know about Jesus' childhood. And so I'm going to start by kind of setting a timeline. Jesus was born in about 4 BC in Bethlehem. This is debated. It could be earlier, like 6 BC. It could be a bit later, like 1 BC. But we don't know exactly. And it was here that the shepherds visited on the night that he was born. And the next thing that happens, so we've already talked a little bit about the shepherds. And the next thing that happens is the story detailed in Luke chapter 2, in which Jesus is presented at the temple. And this presentation is following Levitical law, and it means he would have been presented when he was 40 days old. This is following the laws around purification after childbirth and circumcision, and it's all detailed in Leviticus 12, where it says the woman must wait 7 days after his birth and then 33 days after his circumcision. So that's 40 days in total. This is where Simeon and Anna meet Jesus, who both profess him as the prophesied Messiah. Simeon had been told that he would see the Messiah before he would die, and Anna had been widowed and spent her life in the temple praising God, kind of like a widowed nun almost. I don't know what the equivalent for that would be in Jewish culture, but she spent her life then worshipping. So they both profess him as the prophesied Messiah, and they are the first people to recognize him as such just from meeting him. So the shepherds were told that he was the Messiah. Mary and Joseph were told, for example, and they're the people who, when they meet him, they know that he is who God has been waiting for, who God has had them waiting for. I think that's really cool because it's these two people who spend their whole life in the Spirit and see the law is building that connection with God and that covenant there, and they really work to uphold the covenant from what we do know about them in the story. And they are the people who God reveals it to. So he reveals it to the shepherds, so kind of that lower group and that kind of specialty there. But he also reveals it to the some of the people in the temple involved in worship. Now this is where it can get a little bit difficult piecing it together, as we are reading two different gospel accounts. So the clarity here is difficult because it says after they met with Simeon and Anna, and doing the other things that needed to be done, they returned to Nazareth. And so that's kind of debatable about when they went to Nazareth. And we know that the wise men also meet Jesus in Bethlehem. So he must have been in Bethlehem a little bit longer, because we know that the wise men met Jesus when he was about 1 or 2. And here they warn him that Herod was trying to kill the baby Jesus, and to flee, and they fled to Egypt, and they stayed here until Herod died, after which they returned to Israel. Now, I would like to say all of this is based off like the most commonly agreed upon things within scholars that I could find about when things would have happened. And so it can be hard to piece together because we don't actually know exactly when these things happened. And so the dates of Herod's death here are debated because sometimes people date it before Jesus' birth, but that doesn't quite line up. However, it is believed he probably died before 1 AD, so they wouldn't have remained in Egypt for very long, maybe like a year or two, depending on when Jesus was born and when exactly Herod died. We don't know. But we know it wasn't for a very long time, but it was a little while. And then after that, upon returning, they moved to Nazareth, which was in Galilee. And Nazareth was a very small town, and it's not mentioned much in other historical sources, but it is verifiable that it existed through archaeological sources and some other things. So we know Nazareth existed, we don't know a lot about it. And Nazareth's in town of Galilee, and which historically wasn't always looked well upon by the Jews who lived in Jerusalem. There was kind of tensions there, and they were seen as, to use today's language, more liberal, but I don't really think that quite fits. But there's a whole bunch of stuff about how they were perceived, but that's not quite Jesus' childhood. That's background on Jesus' life. Anyway, after this, so after saying that they returned to Nazareth, the record of Jesus goes quiet. We don't really have a lot of other information. There are some things that we would be able to extrapolate probably happened based off what we know about the time. So we know that he probably learnt his father's trade as a carpenter, as that was something that was commonly taught to sons at that time. So he probably learnt that. He probably followed the traditional education system that of Torah memorization and tests, of which we know a little bit about. So he would have had the Torah memorized. We know he had siblings, the most well-known one being James, who has a book in the Bible. And he had 3 other named brothers, being Jude, Joseph, and Simon. And he also had unnamed sisters. It talks a little bit about his siblings and mum when it talks about him returning to his hometown in Nazareth and preaching the word there and getting rejected, and people saying, "Oh, I know you, you're Jesus," and getting his mum to go pick him up, basically. And these would like technically have been his half siblings in a practical sense, but I don't really think in a technical sense, but I don't think it would have been that important to Jesus in any practical way. We can figure out that Joseph was probably dead by the time that Jesus was working in his ministry, as he isn't talked about anywhere else. He doesn't come into the story, and the story very much deals with things that are currently going on. So he did deal with the kind of grief and loss of a parent. But we do know that Mary was still alive, and she was probably there when she saw him crucified and things. The next story that we have of Jesus is when he was about 12 years old, so probably about 10 years after we saw him last, and kind of the return to Nazareth, flee to Egypt, all of that stuff. Might be a bit of a shorter gap, we don't really know. And this story is recorded in Luke 2:41-51. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured up all these things in her heart, and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. So this story, there is a lot we could unpack here. We're not going to unpack all of this story. I think it's really interesting that it's in there, but that's like the only story we have from his childhood. And we don't hear anything about Jesus until his baptism, and he begins calling his disciples, which is probably when he was about 30, so like over 15 years later. So why are we told what we're told? We're told the stuff from when he's this tiny little baby and toddler, and we're told stuff from when he's 12. And then we're told nothing until his baptism. So why are we told what we're told? And we're told what we're told and what we aren't told for a reason. So what could that reason be? And when you read the Bible isn't a biography of Jesus's life. It's written with a really specific purpose. It's written for us to get to know Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of God and the Son of Man. That he is both God and both human. That he is worthy of worship. And that's like the Gospels, what they're specifically about. The whole story of the Bible is about God's redemption plan. It's a unified story that's all about God and people and redemption and forgiveness. And the Bible focuses on his older adult life because that was his mission, and that's the part where we really see him working in that divine and human balance. And that's the reason he came to earth. And he only started this a few years before his death, not when he was a child. But that doesn't mean that he wasn't God when he was a child, that he wasn't holy God and holy man. Instead, we just hear little stories that it was something he had his whole life. And that there were just these little times where it's recorded, where it came out, where it is visible to other people, even though they might not have known that's what it was. So that's like the story with Simon. That's the story of Jesus and when he was at the temple. And we're told a little bit, and this is to assure us that he is fully human, that he came as human, that he lived a human life from birth to death. But we also know that he had an awareness of God being his father, and as himself as the Son of God. And I really feel like John sums it up really beautifully. Overall lack of information we have about Jesus, and how, sorry, that was my phone, sometimes how we think we know way more than we really do. He says in John 20:30-31, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." So that's what the story of the Bible is about. That is the purpose the Gospels are written, that we are given them, so that we may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing we may have life in his name. And every piece of literature is written with an intention, and they're really explicit in the Gospels that their intention is this, that we may believe. It's not about being completely 100% giving us all the historical facts. That's a tool they use, but that's not the focus, that's not the intention of their work, is to be give us all the historical facts so we can piece it all together and know all about Jesus' life. They want us to believe in him. And so there are many other things that we aren't told, not just about signs that he would have done in the presence of his disciples, but before that, and all sorts, that we're not told so much about his life, but that's okay. And that's kind of a big part of it. So I'll see you all next week as we move past Christmas and see what the new year brings as we dive into some of the stories and ideas and concepts. Thank you for watching. Bye.